Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. I'm continuing with my discussion on the anti-Semitic lynching of Leo Frank in 1915. The trial was in 1913 after Mary Fagan had been, her corpse had been found in the, uh, factory where Leo Frank had been a manager in. She had been murdered April 26, 1913. The trial occurred later on in August 1913. Um, and I'd been looking at the evidence, that's direct evidence versus circumstantial evidence. There was a whole bunch of circumstantial evidence that was put together. A lot of it was fabricated, which we later on found out. There was a test. The only direct evidence was from um, Jim Conley, who was a 27-year-old Black American janitor there. Of course, the atmosphere in Georgia was charged with racism. There was anti-Semitism, so the anti-Semitic whites crowd wanted the conviction of Leo Frank, who was seen as a wealthy Jewish man from New York, representing northern capitalism that had come to sort of violate white southern womanhood and exploit um, the poor white southern females represented by the 13-year-old Mary Fagan, who had gone in to collect her salary of a meager $1 20 cents, but ended up being, according to the prosecution, being sexually assaulted when she tried to, keep her virtue. She was defiled and then murdered by Leo Frank, according to the prosecution. However, the testimony that condemned him was the that of Jim Conley, who claimed that Leo Frank all but confessed to him that he'd struck her, confessed that he had struck her, and he was holding, a jute rope in his hand, the type that was found next to her body, right? Um, now, so and of course the prosecution, both the prosecution, played, manipulated racist, anti-Semitic sentiments, as well as even racist, anti-black uh, sentiments as well, and so did the prosecution. The prosecution, so did the defense. The defense, tried to uh, you know whip up racism against Jim Conley, trying to point out that he was the one who committed the murder. In fact, Luther Rosser kept referring to Jim Conley by the N word. I mean, it was 1913, 19, back then. So he kept calling in the N word. This went on and on. And of course, the prosecution, the prosecution stuck with their claims to portray um, the to sort of demean the respectability of Leo Frank, right, and project him as a Jekyll and Hyde character. And one of the prosecutors, in fact, let me read what one of the prosecutors was said to have. One of the prosecutor's testimonies, that's his name was Frank Cooper. He had actually said that he claimed that Leo Frank was a Dr. Jekyll who, when the shades of night come, throws aside his mask of respectability and is transformed into a Mr. Hyde. That was a statement by Frank Cooper, who was on the prosecution, and of course, uh, and so this was sort of corroborated by the not so credible testimony of Jim Conley, who, however, was very convincing because he had been drilled. He had been, they trained him. The prosecution had drilled him, you know, very rigorously, in what Jim Conley himself called night seances. They drilled him on how to be able to withstand the stern cross examination of the expert uh, Luther Rosser. Luther Rosser, who was the defense attorney, was said to have been a master of cross-examination, and so the prosecution under Hugh Dorsey had actually they drilled and trained Jim Conley how to withstand and not flinch, not to budge under the vigorous cross-examination and abusive cross-examination uh, of Luther Rosser, the defense attorney. Now, now, part of the damning testimony that Jim Conley gave was, when he claimed that he saw, after he said he was in the basement and um, he heard a scream, which was supposed to be Mary Fagan's scream, and when he came up to the second floor where the murder was supposed to have occurred, he saw the body of Mary Fagan, who was dead, and he saw, a rope in the hands of um, Leo Frank with wide crazed eyes, with a wide, crazed look in his eyes, and that he confessed. He said that she had resisted him when he tried to, force himself on her, and he struck her, and her head hit something, and she was dead. And then he said that at some point he looked up, with crazed eyes, and he said, that's Jim Conley saying of Leo Frank, right? So he was projecting this wild, crazy man that, the community had not seen in his, veneer of respectability. So Jim Conley claimed that Leo Frank, mused and said that why should I hang? I have wealthy friends in Brooklyn, and that's what he said. He was supposed to have said, and of course, in his defense, Ruben Arnold claimed that, look, so this is another example of uh, the racism, there was anti-Semitism, and of course there was anti-black racism going on. Now, Ruben Arnold, who was accusing the murderer to be Jim Conley, that it was an N-word, that he was the one who was drunk and who ended up killing uh, Mary Fagan, uh, was not accusing Georgians of being and the prosecution accusing them of being anti-Semitic, that they were charging the wrong man. And this is what Ruben Arnold, who was also on the defense team, this is what he said. He said that Leo Frank's great misfortune is that he comes from a race of people that have made money. So you could see the atmosphere, you could see the atmosphere in the charged atmosphere in Georgia, right? And this was what the defense was trying to say, that look, that he's only been indicted, that Leo Frank would never have been indicted if he were not a Jew. That the reason why he's being indicted and why he's being tried for the murder of uh, Mary Fagan was because he was a wealthy Jewish man, right? And he comes from the Jewish race. So this is what his defense attorney Ruben Arnold was saying outright. Now, the the another piece of damning evidence that convinced the jury, which is kind of really interesting, is the were the notes that were the apparent murder notes scribbled by Jim Conley, who confessed. He said he'd been forced by Leo Frank to write the two notes, and they were found right next to the body of um Mary Fagan. So I'm going to read those notes written by Jim Conley. Now, they're written in a kind of Southern Black vernacular, right? They're poorly written, right? They're very poorly written, but it's interesting that I did Harlem Renaissance, and there was this novel that I had to read. I can't remember its name, but the author was Zora Neale Hest, Zora Neale Huston, right? Zora Neale Huston. Um, she graduated uh, from Bernard. She wrote, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and she wrote in a certain vernacular style, and it was called, jungle black jungle writing, and she was encouraged by white patrons, rich white patrons, to write in that way. Even though she wrote beautifully, I've talked about her, Zora Neale Hurston. She was the reporter that drew national attention to the in the trial of Ruby Jackson, the wealthy black woman in Florida, who was accused of killing uh, a a white politician and physician who was father of her child. I've done a video regarding that, in honor of Black History Month, so you can look it up. Um, so Zora Neale Hurston used to write in this sort of vernacular style to depict how blacks supposedly spoke. So, despite the vernacular style of writing, it is kind of funny that the uh, the you know the prosecution, they deflected and said, well, that it's absurd to suggest that Jim Conley wrote. I'm going to read the writing that he said that it's absurd to suggest that he wrote that Jim Conley was responsible for the writing. He goes, these Negroes, suggesting the thought that Jim Conley would have written those notes by himself is absurd. So basically, they were pointing out that, look, black people are not smart. They're not intelligent to write uh, on their own initiative, right? They're averse to writing. They're not literate people, and so that he must have been coerced. That's what the prosecution was saying. He must have been coerced by the literate, the Ivy League, Cornell mechanical engineering, uh, Leo Frank, wealthy Leo Frank. That he must have been the one who, orchestrated the writing, and even perhaps somehow, maybe through telepathic means, I don't know, put the words to write inside the mind uh, of Jim Conley, right, the black janitor you know, who gave the the dispositive testimony, direct evidence against Leo Frank. So I'm going to read the writing. It just shows you the racism of the time. The writing. I'm going to read it right now. So So this again was written by Jim Conley. He confessed that he wrote it. So it goes, "Ma'am, that Negro hired down here did this. I went to make water and he pushed me down that hole. A long, tall Negro, black, that who is waist, long, slim, tall Negro. It's right while play with me." And that's the first note. And the second note, because there are two notes, scribbled notes that were on two different pieces of paper. And so this is the second piece that I'm reading from. "He said he would love me, land down, play like me, night which did it, but that long, tall, black Negro did by himself." That's the writing, right? So that's a piece of writing that Jim Conley admitted that, well, he was induced by by Leo Frank, the Jewish man accused, of murdering Mary Fagan. That so Jim Conley accused that Leo Frank had dictated that piece of writing, right? That he had dictated that piece of writing. So um, what the prosecution was saying was that, well, it was Leo Frank who dictated and orchestrated the whole writing to make it seem like some kind of black vernacular, to more to implicate in order to implicate uh, to implicate Newt Lee, the night watchman, right? But he intentionally dictated a black, an ostensible black vernacular to make it seem like um, Jim Conley wrote it on his own initiative, right? However, the prosecution says, you know, these Negroes, right? Suggesting that, Jim Conley, would have written those notes by himself was absurd, right? So that's what the prosecution said. Um, so despite all of this, and again, and the prosecution, um, it was found out, would pay witnesses. Again, there were witnesses that would come, like a woman named Nina Hornby. She was the owner, proprietor of an inn, a hostel, and she claimed that the night before that Leo Frank had called several times to reserve a room. And this was testimony she gave in court at trial, that Leo Frank had called several times to reserve a room for him and a woman, that he was coming in with a young woman. Um, However, there was the maid who worked there contradicted that testimony, but this was never presented at trial, right? The maid said that call never came in, and she's the one who, and she knows because she's the one who answers all calls, and that call would have come to her. She said her boss doesn't answer calls, and she said she never spoke with anybody, any Leo Frank, any man, reserving a room for him and a young woman. So later on, after the conviction, and the post-trial appeals, this same Nina Hornby would disavow, she'd recant and say, well, that she was pressured by the police and, the prosecution to lie, right? And so it was discovered later on that the prosecution actually paid several people to give false testimony. But this was after the conviction of Leo Frank. So you can see, and it's unfortunate. Later evidence would come. There was a young boy, a 14-year-old boy, who worked at the factory named Alonzo Mann. Alonzo Mann had already told his mother, right? He told his mother that he saw Jim Conley carrying the body um, of Mary Fagan. I saw him carrying the body alone. And he was a boy, he was 14 years old. He went to tell his mother, and that Jim Conley told him he would kill him if he told anybody. But he told his mother, but the mother said, hey, he shouldn't tell anybody, he should stay out of it, and he shouldn't bring it up unless anybody comes to him. So that contradicted Jim Conley's state claims that he and Leo Frank had carried the body of Mary Fagan together through the elevator and taking it down to the basement, right? So that was conflicting evidence, right? But the boy never gave that. He didn't present it to the prosecution. Besides, even if he had done, the prosecution was suppressing evidence, was fabricating evidence, because they're focused on getting a conviction against Leo Frank, and this was because of the anti-Semitism that was going on in Georgia in the South at the time. And there was the yellow journalism of Tom Watson. Tom Watson would go on to become a U.S. Senator. By the time he was a congressman here, and he was the editor of a very prominent, journal in Atlanta, the Jeffersonian. And all he was doing was, he was whipping up a lot of anti-Semitic sentiments at that time against, a lot of anti-Semitic prejudice to seek a conviction against Leo Frank. What is very interesting is that after the lynching of Leo Frank, the conviction and lynching of Leo Frank, two critical organizations, right, would arise, right? The lynching would instigate the creation of two organizations. One is the anti Semitic organization, that's the Anti Defamation League, which still exists today. And then the other was the new KKK, the new Ku Klux Klan. They call themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan, the Knights of Mary Fagan, right, in her honor. And This grew up in Georgia. Of course, remember that under President Ulysses Grant, through the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act, he destroyed the KKK at the time. The KKK had been, ex-Confederate soldiers, right, that, were rising up, terrorizing black people, from trying to stop blacks from being able to exercise their civil rights at the time. But now with the murder of Mary Fagan, and at the time, Southern whites in Georgia had blamed the murder on the northern Jewish man, because they hated carpetbaggers, right? Carpetbaggers were northerners who came and were trying to tell the black man to exercise his civil rights and not be subordinate or subservient to southern whites, right? So Leo Frank was, even though he had no apparent political affiliation, was seen as a carpetbagger, right? And so this new KKK organization arose. They called themselves Knights of Mary Fagan, and they organized in Georgia, right? So, and this was, and of course, remember that in 1915, in February 1915, um, the the Klansman. That was what he was called then. It subsequently became Birth of the Nation. That was the name of uh, the movie, the racist movie valorizing the Ku Klux Klan. It was screened in the White House when President Woodrow Wilson was president. So I'm going to stop this video here, and I'm going to continue and look at the aftermath and the proceedings as well, and then the aftermath of the anti-Semitic lynching of Leo Frank. This is very important to me because done videos talking about how I've been wrongfully accused and I've been framed in Montgomery County, Maryland. It's racist and it's intended to obstruct justice. And so we're seeing how, unfortunately, an innocent man can be, false narratives can be used to smear the character of an innocent man, and the courts can be abused. Evidence can be used to convict an innocent man. Unfortunately, this man was also was subsequently lynched. That's Leo Frank. So because it happens, and many blacks, innocent black people, are convicted of crimes they never committed, and it shows the corruption of a lot of the law enforcement, the prosecution, and the criminal justice system in the South. This happened over 110 years ago, but it's still happening today. Maryland is a southern state. Montgomery County is known to have a prominent Ku Klux Klan presence. The day the police came and they assaulted me in my home, it came like a lynch mob. I've been stunned by the way they fabricated evidence. They've created false witness, fabricated testimony, made perjured statements. And I'm an innocent man. I'm a law abiding, upstanding, innocent man. The evidence is there that I'm innocent, but this malicious prosecution is going on under a racist state attorney, John McCarthy, and a racist judge, Judge James Bonifant of Montgomery County, Maryland. In any event, I'm going to continue with my discussion on the anti-Semitic lynching of Leo Frank. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.